I think that I often say it's a false dichotomy that you have to pick a side. In the beginning of all this, I was often asked, how do you pick which side to be on? And there's never been a side for me. I am a man of Indigenous heritage. That is a fact of life. I can't pretend it's not that way. But I am a man of Indigenous heritage who has happily received the Catholic faith and who believes that I have been called by God to serve him as a priest. And so in my life, these things are not incompatible, let alone irreconcilable. And therefore, what I have hoped to be able to contribute to this discourse and to the dynamics in our country at this time is to hopefully provide a credible witness to the fact that reconciliation is possible, that one can be a person of faith and an Indigenous person all at once. One can be a Catholic and an Indigenous person, a priest and an Indigenous person, and that they can be held together. But to summarize myself under only one category, I fear can end up just lumped into this whole dynamic of identity politics that we find ourselves trapped in at this time. And I think it's actually moving out of that and living the freedom that being ourselves can truly give us that will help us on that path forward with reconciliation.
Adam Soos here for Rebel News, just outside of Sacred Heart Church here in Edmonton, Alberta. This location will welcome Pope Francis as part of his tour across the country as he seeks to make amends and heal some of the wounds caused by the legacy of residential schools. Few issues in this country's young history garner the same level of emotional response as the legacy of residential schools, a legacy which did not come to a close, troublingly, until 1996 in this country. Now, conversations around residential schools and the emotional response associated with them have clearly been exacerbated by troubling reports of mass graves across Canada appearing. Now, these mass graves and these reports have largely been debunked as either historically inaccurate or just factually false, but that does nothing to discount the hardship endured by Indigenous communities as a result of the residential schools. As I already mentioned, Pope Francis is set to arrive here in Edmonton and then make his way across the country, and we have an extensive team from Rebel News that has been accredited to cover this, yes, by Global Affairs Canada. Further acknowledgement of the important work that we are doing. You can find all those reports at popereports.com. But today I wanted to get a bit of an insider's perspective on the upcoming papal visit and speak to a Catholic priest with Indigenous heritage who is instrumental in organizing this upcoming visit. So I'm going to head over now to another church here in Edmonton, St. John the Evangelist, to speak with Father Cristino Bouvet, share a little bit of his story, and learn more about what Pope Francis hopes to accomplish with his visit. And as I mentioned, I am now joined by Father Cristino Bouvet. You're sort of intimately involved in the organization of the papal visit, but you do have sort of a more personal connection to some of the residential school stories that are clearly being addressed during this papal visit. Could you talk maybe a little bit about that legacy, maybe some family connections you have, and then what the Pope's visit means?
Certainly. So my paternal grandmother was a student for 12 years in what was then known as the Edmonton Indian Residential School for Girls. And she completed her entire education there. So that meant 12 years of most of her life, her childhood at least, away from her family. And her mother passed away during that time. She was not able to be there with her when that happened. So there was an enduring legacy, obviously, of pain, of what was lost, or what she ended up not having had the freedom or the opportunity to experience as many other children would have normally had that opportunity. So there is that legacy. But that said, I would say, compared to many who we know suffered all sorts of kinds of trauma from being in the school, she fared well enough to live a peaceful life, a healthy life. She raised 14 children. She was the most truly incredible person that I knew, and she was a faithful woman, a deep Christian conviction. And so she instilled that in all of us as well, and was extremely supportive of my eventual discernment to become a priest. And so I can only imagine now, she's passed on from this life, what she would be thinking to see her priest grandson helping to coordinate the visit of the Pope to Canada for this question of Indigenous reconciliation.
Certainly, I'm sure she's looking down and smiling. There does seem to be a sort of, I mean, maybe not from your perspective, maybe not from the perspectives of many in the Indigenous community, but from what we're hearing in the media, what we hear out there, there seems to be a contrast. They've sort of created this narrative of Catholic versus Indigenous. As someone with Indigenous roots who is a Catholic priest, how do you reconcile that? Or is it an artificial divide?
Well, I think that I often say it's a false dichotomy that you have to pick a side. In the beginning of all this, I was often asked, how do you pick which side to be on? And there's never been a side for me. I am a man of Indigenous heritage. That is a fact of life. I can't pretend it's not that way. Mm-hmm. But I am a man of Indigenous heritage who has happily received the Catholic faith and who believes that I have been called by God to serve him as a priest. And so in my life, these things are not incompatible, let alone irreconcilable. And mm-hmm. therefore, what I have hoped to be able to contribute to this discourse and to the dynamics in our country at this time is to hopefully provide a credible witness to the fact that reconciliation is possible, that one can be a person of faith and an Indigenous person all at once. One can be a Catholic and an Indigenous person, a priest and an Indigenous person, and that they can be held together. But to summarize myself under only one category, I fear can end up just lumped into this whole dynamic of identity politics that we find ourselves trapped in at this time. And I think it's actually moving out of that and living the freedom that being ourselves can truly give us that will help us on that path forward with reconciliation.
Yeah, there's 100% this effort to label you. You must be this or you must be that. One thing that I found incredibly interesting, I went to Siksika after they experienced arson at their Catholic church, and they had shoes near the altar. And I asked, is this like a protest or what's going on here? And they're like, no, it's in commemoration, and they want this to be part of the healing process. So there too, from the Indigenous community and Father Long, I believe it is there, mm-hmm. for them it was, no, we're part of this healing process together. That being said, healing does imply that there was a wound. And just to clarify maybe a little bit of history, who was involved with the residential schools, and has there been a formal apology?
So we need to first of all make clear where these schools came from. Mm-hmm. And so without question, this was a policy and program of the federal government that was designed and implemented and funded. So there is no debate to be had about where these schools came from and who wanted them. It mm-hmm. was the federal government. Now, they were staffed by almost always, especially in the beginning, church groups. And in Canada, specifically, the growing and most available, if you will, church group at that time were the Roman Catholics. And so priests and nuns and consecrated brothers were certainly, no one can deny that history, mm-hmm. that these were people who participated in the administration of these institutions. But as for whether or not there has ever been a formal apology, Prime Minister Harper offered an apology on behalf of the federal government, I believe back in 2008, addressing what now we are able to acknowledge as having been a systemic error in judgment on the part of the federal government in seeking a process of complete assimilation of an entire cultural group of people into a new and imposed way of life.
We now recognize that it was wrong to separate children from rich and vibrant cultures and traditions, that it created a void in many lives and communities, and we apologize for having done this.
So that, I think, needed to be addressed for what it was, and it has been. The church, in whatever capacity, the institution of the church has taken part in that. We have also tried to address and recognize and express, as Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul II did previously, the sorrow that is felt on behalf of the members of the church that know that we participated in this. Now, some felt that that was not going far enough, that that did not satisfy the needs of those who have suffered to hear from the Roman Catholic Church. And in response to that, Pope Francis could not have more clearly stated on April 1st to a delegation of Indigenous elders in Rome, I am sorry. I am very sorry. And he is speaking on behalf of the institution of the church when he does so. And now we expect that when he comes to Canada next week, he will do the same again on our own lands. And for those who will say that it's still not right or it's still not enough, I'm sure there will be some. And to them, I would just simply ask for what it is that they are seeking that has not yet been delivered.
So on that note, Pope Francis talked about hoping that this is an opportunity for healing, that is part of the intention. Is he speaking in a spiritual sense, or is he talking about sort of pragmatic steps towards reconciliation?
I think both. For sure, he wants it to be a spiritual experience because he's a spiritual leader. So he wants people to experience healing on the deepest level of who we are. And especially among Indigenous people, being tuned into that is something almost second nature, if you will, being tuned into the spiritual. And so he knows that, and I think appreciates the need to address that healing there on that level. But he also doesn't want it to just be some figment of our imagination that we talk about in nice words and hope that people feel somehow in their heart. There does need to be concrete steps and action that are taken. And to suggest that there will be in the future is not to say that there have not been already.
Right.
There have been many concrete steps taken on the part of the institutional structure of the Catholic Church, but just in the day-to-day administration of how the Church operates, the incorporation of and involvement of Indigenous peoples taking active part in the life of the local church. That is already a part of our reality, and it's going to continue to be the case. We would hope even more so now that there will be this renewed motivation that we hope and pray the papal visit is going to bring.
Some of the sort of damage and maybe even the sort of basis and cultural atmosphere that led to the residential schools is certainly contributing to the fact that there are still Indigenous reservations that do not have clean drinking water. In fact, in some areas, the water is toxic or carcinogenic. Kids can't even have baths. Is there an opportunity for church authorities or even the Pope himself to call on Catholics and on a country to, while still addressing the ills of the wrong, prove that there has been a shift and take action on one of the just human rights violations that we're seeing today?
That's an interesting question. I think people expect that kind of thing from Pope Francis because of the kind of Pope that he is. He doesn't ever seem to shy away from confronting earthly powers and earthly authorities with what he believes addresses the fundamental needs and rights of human beings. And so I won't be surprised if he were to make reference to, either implicitly or explicitly, the conditions of those who continue to live in such Indigenous reservations across the country, where that need is not being met on a governmental level. So as I say, I won't be surprised if he does. But that should not be his primary focus, and I don't expect that it will be, because at the same time, it's not appropriate for him to seek to meddle in the affairs of something outside. We've gotten into this mess for being too tightly woven together with the government, and we're not going to do ourselves any favor by ending up back in there in the name of trying to make things better. We need to be who we are supposed to be, and if only we had always remained focused on what that meant and what that looked like, maybe things would be different now. And so I suspect that he will exercise a measure of some caution around wading into that too intensely or too explicitly.
Now, a large reason that this conversation has been so stirred up is because of the somewhat scandalous headlines about mass graves that kind of reignited this conversation. In retrospect, looking back, it seems as though some of those overstated or were factually inaccurate. Not to disparage or discredit what happened in residential schools, but ground penetrating radar research indicates there were lost cemeteries or it was an orchard that was misidentified. But that really picked at the scab of reconciliation. As a result of that, we saw churches burnt down, mass vandalism, a serious divide. I just wanted to ask you, how fundamental is truth in the truth and reconciliation part, and how important is it to stay from maybe ideological politicization?
Well, it implies in its name that we cannot have reconciliation if we have not had truth. I think that there has been perhaps a narrow interpretation of what we mean by truth, which is that people who have suffered have the opportunity to openly express what they've been through, and we should absolutely be doing that. But what we cannot allow ourselves to be put into the position of facilitating or participating in is, in the name of that truth being brought to the surface, participating in anything that would be untrue. Now, I don't mean to suggest that there is anyone who has done that or is seeking to do that. That's just a statement of fact. But we can't expect, with the participation in anything untrue, other important truths to be better emphasized. So that just, I think, is a philosophical base premise that we need to operate from out of. As for what led to, or these precipitating events that has caused all of this to happen, to me, I always have thought to myself about my kokum, who shared one of the most disturbing experiences with me of her time in the residential school, was precisely not being allowed to attend to her dying brother in the adjacent school, to be present when he was buried, or take part in his funeral rites. I can't comprehend why that would not have been facilitated. But it also presupposes that there was a funeral and that he was buried. She talked about getting to go to visit his grave later. What worries me about this entire topic is that we turn something that we've already known about into news. And because something is news to someone else does not mean that it's news in general. And we have to be careful about how that gets communicated. We have to be so sensitive in how that is communicated, because in the name of wanting to seek the truth, we can end up allowing truths to become a cudgel that hurts people, that, as you said earlier, can pick at a scab that was perhaps even already beginning to heal. And so we have to just simply be aware, whether that has anything to do with the question of graves, where children who died while in residential school are buried, or any of the what we might call allegations that some people claim to contest as being factual or not. All of that has to be dealt with second to what are the consequences of bringing those things to the surface and how they're brought to the surface. Because those are real people and real life experiences that are going to be very vulnerably put forward. And so when that is done, it must be done with immense sensitivity and having borne in mind what are going to be the implications for the people directly impacted by what's about to be shared.
And finally, obviously, there's no denying that there was an extreme legacy of damage from the residential schools. Many people have left the church, left their faith with reference to those indignities, the lack of acknowledgement of human dignity for those communities. What do you say to people as a priest who are maybe struggling with their faith or have left their faith because of the residential school legacy?
Well, you just asked a moment ago about truth. And I simply ask people to look within themselves and to examine in their own hearts, their minds, their conscience, what do they believe is true? And for those who have come to the conclusion that the truths of the Catholic faith that we profess are in fact true, then that has been enough for them to be able to remain committed to the practice of their Catholic faith, to the preservation of their Catholic faith. For others, the experiences that they themselves had or later came to discover their loved ones had perhaps has caused them to question whether or not any of those things are true. And I don't fault them for having that dilemma. But what we must always go back to is that question: is this true? What is truth? So that we can base our decisions and how we live and how we practice religion, or just simply live our lives on a basis of truth, and not emotion that is certainly going to fluctuate as many times a day as we can imagine. And so I would simply try and encourage my brothers and sisters, especially in the Indigenous community, to ask themselves from that perspective: do I believe this is true? And if they do, then to not be dissuaded by the practice from the practice of their faith by these difficult things that we continue to confront about our past.
Well, Christina Bouvet, I want to thank you so much for your time. We will be here, obviously, throughout next week for the Pope's visit, addressing some of these difficult issues. As always, I want to thank everyone at home for tuning in. For Rebel News, I'm Adam Soos. As I mentioned, we will have an extensive team from Rebel News covering Pope Francis's upcoming visit to Canada. We will certainly have some folks here in Edmonton, and Alexa, I believe, is going to swing by. She has been accredited in Quebec to cover his stops there, so we're very much looking forward to bringing you the other side of the story on Pope Francis's visit. For all of those reports, go to popereports.com.